Thank you so much. So thank you for having me here today. I'm super excited about getting invited to talk at this Marine Spatial Planning workshop. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Karen Alexander and I'm based at the University of Tasmania in Australia. And I am a part of the Centre for Marine Socioecology at the University of Tasmania. So I'm particularly interested in aspects around socioecology and interdisciplinary research. So today I just want to talk a little bit about marine spatial planning and governance. And I think the title kind of gives away a little bit around some of the points that I'm going to make today. And I think the main thing that I would really like to see come out of this is taking away the message that marine spatial planning occurs within governance, and it also governance also occurs within marine spatial planning as well. So if I can, there we go. So I want to start with this quote of "We don't manage fish, we manage people." This is a common saying in fisheries science, and it's becoming increasingly common amongst natural scientists more broadly as they begin to realise the importance of the human component of managing the marine environment. Marine spatial planning is a means by which to manage people, but governance too is all about how we manage people, and so marine spatial planning and governance go hand in hand really. And not only that, as I've said already, we can consider marine spatial planning at the macro scale as one tool in the wider governance of the marine environment. And we can also consider the micro scale of governance that occurs within marine spatial planning processes. And today I just want to think about both aspects. So I want us to start thinking about what we mean by governance, particularly as it's quite an amorphous term. So I would propose that governance is a complex puzzle made up of organisations, people and divergent interests who decide the way in which rules, norms and actions are structured, sustained, regulated and held accountable. So how about that for an abstract definition? Hopefully, though, this will become clearer as we work our way through how it relates to marine spatial planning. In recent times, we've seen a new mode of governing which is different from the traditional hierarchical top-down form. So we've seen a move towards more network-based forms of decision-making, which includes external stakeholders in governing and policy implementation. And this is a really important point when we talk about governance. Governance is more than just government. It's more than just policy and regulation. In this space, the economy and society are also involved. So, for example, market-based instruments, which use the market to target low-cost actions to meet policy goals. And they encourage behaviours through market signals rather than through explicit directives, which is what regulation does. And society can also contribute to governance in a variety of ways. So society can act as a watchdog, it can act as an advocate or an agitator, or it can act as a service provider. And according to Van Tatenhove 2011, marine governance is defined as the following. So, quote, "The sharing of policy-making competencies in a system of negotiation between nested governmental institutions at several levels." And that's the international, the supranational and the subnational on one hand, and then state actors, market parties and civil society organisations of different maritime activities on the other hand, in order to govern activities at sea and their consequences, unquote. Now, another concept to consider is that of good governance, and this is a concept that originated around discourses on poverty and development due to the millions of people living in conditions of public insecurity and instability who hope for good governance. And there are considered to be 8 elements to this concept. There's accountability, transparency, responsiveness, equity and inclusion, effectiveness and efficiency, following the rule of law, participation, and consensus building. So I just wanted to sort of have a chat about what governance actually is, and the fact that it is broader than government, because this is a really important thing in marine spatial planning. So marine spatial planning, for a while at least, was heralded the savior for management of the marine and coastal environment, and it's risen to prominence really quickly. Most likely because it's very simple in nature, it's easy to use by non-specialists, and it also comes often with this idea of it being a win-win solution. But as someone who researches ocean and coastal conflict, I can guarantee that putting one group of people in one box and another group of people in another isn't going to miraculously stop them fighting or make them think they've won anything. I'm aware that this is a huge simplification of the marine process to think of it in this way, but I think it's really important to recognise. Marine spatial planning is one tool that can contribute towards smart governing of human activities in the seas if it is used in conjunction with other tools, such as gear specifications, catch and days at sea limits, seabed licenses, things like that. As I'm sure you already know, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to marine spatial planning. Indeed, the process needs to be adjusted to fit the specific marine environments alongside their defining political, ecological, social, and economic characteristics. And this means that we also really need to consider how marine spatial planning fits into the broader sets of processes and systems and power dynamics that already exist in trying to manage the marine environment. We can see one way in which this has been considered through the Victorian, in Australia, marine spatial planning process, where a marine spatial planning framework has been developed not to replace single sector planning, but rather to provide overarching guidance on planning, management and decision making by marine sectors. And the framework details the essential elements and steps necessary for achieving integrated and coordinated planning and management of Victoria's marine environment. So at the broader scale, marine spatial planning is one tool in the wider governance of the marine environment. But now I actually want to move on to the smaller scale and more the main focus of this session, and that's governance within the marine spatial planning process. So as we know, there are a variety of steps involved in the marine spatial planning process. If we go by the IOC UNESCO guide, for example, there's 10 steps: establishing authority, obtaining finance, organising the process, engaging stakeholders, analysing existing and future conditions, developing the plan, implementing the plan, evaluating performance and adapting the process. And governance influences each of these steps. At each of these steps, a variety of groups might be involved in making decisions about how the process works. So, for example, at the establishing authority stage, authority to plan and to implement could be combined in one organisation, or a new authority might be established for planning, and I'll talk more on that later. While implementation might be carried out through existing authorities and institutions. Or planning and implementation might be undertaken by a mixture of existing organisations. Depending on which options used, very different perspectives and power dynamics might influence the process, and that's also key. As another example, when it comes to analysing existing and future conditions, governance of this component will likely have a strong influence on acceptance of the process. So how will the data be collected? Whose data will be used? Will it be data from scientists, from users, from citizen scientists, and again, more on this later, or from Indigenous peoples? How will the data be managed and by whom? And governance processes influence the answers to all of these questions. When it comes to implementing the plan, governance is key. What management actions are required to implement, ensure compliance with, and enforce spatial management plans? Who will be responsible for delivering these actions? Will it be that super agency that we established in the authority step, or will it again be some sort of amalgamation of different institutions working together? And so perhaps it's useful actually to consider a few of these questions using specific case examples, and that's what I'm going to do now. So in most cases, it's likely that an existing single sector management institution will carry out most actions towards the development and implementation of a marine plan. For example, in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, management actions have been undertaken by 3 levels of government: by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, for federal waters, which is those waters beyond 3 nautical miles, by appropriate state agencies for marine waters under the jurisdiction of the state of Florida, so that's for within 3 nautical miles, and then by Monroe County for land. However, as I mentioned earlier, some countries have opted to develop new supermarine management agencies to deliver their marine spatial planning. So in England, the Marine Management Organisation was established with the purpose of undertaking marine spatial planning as well as other activities. They aim to develop marine plans for the northeast, northwest, southeast and southwest inshore and offshore areas, and their process was launched back in 2016. And the Marine Management Organisation led an iterative process with input from all stakeholders who had an interest in these marine plan areas which were covered by these marine plans. And the launch commenced with a call for issues with supporting evidence. Iterative ports of call along the journey were then made for draft visions, policy options, preferred policies, etc. And they held workshops, webinars, discussions. And then in early 2020, a formal statutory consultation was held. Plans are due to be completed next year, and it appears that they're on track to do so. So perhaps one benefit of having a supermarine management agency running the show is overall accountability to deliver on time. Slightly different is an example from my home country of Scotland. Marine Scotland is the government agency responsible for developing the National Marine Plan, which was published in 2015. However, 11 Scottish marine regions were created that cover sea areas out to 12 nautical miles. And regional marine plans were to be developed by what were called regional marine planning partnerships. The idea behind this was that it would allow more local ownership and decision-making about specific area-based issues. The partnerships were expected to vary in size and composition depending on the area and also the issues to be dealt with in existing groups. However, to my knowledge, so far only 2 of the 11 regions have actually developed plans, and both of those were involved in pilot-scale marine spatial planning programs prior to this process began. And that's the same state as when I left Scotland 5 years ago, so not much has changed in that time. I can't find any information regarding the existence of any other partnerships. So it seems to me that there might be some really interesting questions here about the governance of regional versus nationally led marine spatial planning processes. As a second example, I want to talk a little bit about citizen science. So if you think about it, that first example was very much related to governance in the form of government and the role that government plays. This second example about citizen science is very much about society and the role that society can play in marine spatial planning. So while citizen science is being increasingly used to provide fine-scale environmental data across large terrestrial planning areas, so far there hasn't been a huge amount of uptake in marine spatial planning. However, it is a good example of how the general public can participate in the governance of marine spatial planning. Not only can the public help in the process step of analysing existing conditions by collecting baseline data and identifying hotspots of good and poor environmental health, they can also participate in the evaluation step by identifying where environmental health has improved or degraded during the time that a marine spatial plan has been in place. And an example of this can be found in the Hauraki Gulf Marine Park in New Zealand. A study by Jarvis et al. Used an online survey that was open for 7 weeks to investigate the potential of using citizen science in marine spatial planning. They used a software called Sea Sketch so that participants could enter data on an online map of the marine park, detailing the health of the environment at each location and how the health had changed over the past 5 years. The study received thousands of data points and some really interesting findings. However, of course, there are several limitations. Most importantly, it's unclear if the results reflected the actual health of the environment or just public perceptions of the environment. And so data quality is obviously a potential issue in cases such as these. But if the data can be triangulated with other field-based data to check for quality, perhaps this is a useful way of incorporating society as a service provider for marine spatial planning purposes. And there are many other existing citizen science programs which could be incorporated into the governance of marine spatial planning. A couple that I'm aware of in Australia include Reef Check, which mainly focuses on coral reefs, such as the Great Barrier Reef, and REDMAP, which focuses on the movement of species due to climate change. I'm sure there's loads of other citizen science projects around the world that could get involved in marine spatial planning in this way. And then as a third example, I want to look at that economy part of governance through zone permit fees. So as I mentioned, the economy also has a role to play when it comes to governance and marine spatial planning. And this may be in many ways. It may be due to the practical and political realities of securing funding for the management of marine spatial plans, step 2 of the process, or it may be in order to influence human behaviour, as I mentioned earlier, and that might relate to step 8 of the planning process, that's implementing the plan. So one way in which this might happen is through zone permit fees, and there's various types of marine-related fees that might be charged, so fishing licence fees, vessel registration fees, diving fees, fees for marine research, for development applications, or even for conservation. And one example of where this does occur is in the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in Australia, which is considered by many as one of the world's better working examples of marine zoning. Activities within the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park is regulated by permits, and permits are required for several activities, such as commercial activities, installing or repairing infrastructure, aquaculture facilities, dredging or dumping, waste discharge, moorings, anchoring, research and education. The list kind of goes on. And new permits, if granted, are generally for a year, which allows time to establish the operation and provides the applicant and the marine park managers an opportunity for review. Existing permit holders who then apply to continue the operation and satisfy the assessment requirements are granted a permit from 6 to 15 years, depending on the activities. And this example very much relates to step 2 of the planning process. The fees are actually, in this case, used to cover the costs of management. However, when a permit's issued, it usually has really detailed conditions that specify when, where, and how the activity can occur, and further specifies management requirements, most often relating to environmental impact. And so this has the side effect of also influencing how humans behave. So, as I noted earlier, governance plays a role in the marine spatial planning process at every step. Without the negotiations between nested government institutions and state actors, market parties and civil society organisations, and without the sharing of responsibilities between such networks, it's really unlikely that any marine spatial planning process would even get off the starting block. It's all very well collecting all the biophysical data and all the human use data, and then drawing lines on maps saying, you can have this area and you can have that area. But if you can't get buy-in from the stakeholders, if you can't ensure someone is accountable for the management, the implementation, and the enforcement, then marine spatial planning will not happen. So it's my opinion, and I might be a little bit biased here, to be honest, because blue governance is my thing, but it's my opinion that governance really is the most important component of marine spatial planning. And on that note, I think I'll stop talking there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was a super interesting presentation.